Now, before we begin our final session, I hope that throughout today you guys have felt inspired or felt motivated or felt hope. How many of you have felt any of those things throughout today? Oh, amazing. Yes. And sometimes when we're trying to accomplish this daunting undertaking of taking on child sexual exploitation in the trafficking industry, it can feel overwhelming. And one of the things that always helps me is I love this quote by Edward Everett Hale. He said that, "I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something, and I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do." And I hope we can all take that with us throughout today, throughout the week, and throughout the remainder of this year, as we think about the contribution that we can make in this area. Our final panel here today, I'm very excited about, is we're going to hear from elected officials and how they're making an impact and how you can too. And getting involved with local government is always a powerful way that we can join forces with the public and government to make a difference in our country, in our communities, in our cities. Opening the session will be former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Very excited to hear from him. After his remarks, we'll hear from Representative Angela Romero, Congressman Blake Moore, and County Prosecutor Ron Welch. The panel will be moderated by my good friend Dawn Hawkins, back there in the back. She's the CEO of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, a nonpartisan, non-sectarian organization with nearly 60 years history. Immediately following this session, we will be privileged to hear from co-founder of the Malouf Foundation, Kacie Malouf, and she will wrap up the day. Thank you, Robert O'Brien.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction, and it's great to be here with you. I'm just grateful for the Malouf Foundation and for Sam and Kacie who founded it. Your leadership and your dedication on these issues, and for organizing this second annual summit. I was here last year for the summit, which was a great summit, and this is a wonderful encore. It's just exemplary. I mean, one of the great characteristics about the United States of America is how good men and women step up and they devote their time and their talents and their resources to helping their fellow citizens. And these traits make America unique among the nations of the world. And so Sam and Kacie, your generosity inspires us. Thank you. It makes us proud to be Utahns. It makes us proud to be Americans. And for many of us, it makes us proud to be Latter-day Saints. And so you're great Americans. Thank you for everything you're doing. And let's have a round of applause for Sam and Kacie. One of the things you'll find, there are a lot of philanthropists in this country and a lot of great men and women who give a lot of money to different causes, but they make sure you know that it came from them. You never know it with Sam and Kacie. They're very quiet, and it makes it all the more meaningful what you do. So I also want to thank everyone on the Malouf team. I mean, these are terrific events, these summits, but there are other things that happen during the year, and it's always it's incredibly professional. And so for the whole Malouf team, thank you, and for the folks that fed us today and served us, we appreciate it. But I do want to note two people. I can't note everybody, but I want to note two people. One is Charlie Friedman, and the other is Jeff Steed. I don't know if they're here. Jeff, Charlie, are you around? There's Jeff. I don't see Charlie, but you've done. There's just Charlie in the back as usual, trying to. That's an old law school trick. You'd sit in the back row. I did that many times, but it's not just on today's event that they've contributed so much. It's what's going to happen, the follow-through, because today's event is to raise awareness. It's to get folks on the same page, it's to motivate people, but it's the follow-through that's going to be so important, and thank you, Charlie and Jeff. I think we're all humbled, I certainly am, by the survivors, and the fact that you're here and willing to share your stories and provide hope to others is inspirational. It gives people hope, and it gives other victims the perseverance and resilience to keep going under the most difficult circumstances. So thank you. This is a sobering subject. It's hard to get people to engage in this subject because, as you sat and listened to the last panel, and the women who were here were just marvelous in what they do and how they help people. But it's a tough subject. It's tough to get people to sit and listen to it and hear what needs to be done. And so thank you all for being here and doing so. So let's start today's talk with going to the front pages. And I don't think there's anything that we're all riveted by what's happening on TV. We're watching what's happening in Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine. I was there in 2014 to monitor elections. It was their first truly democratic parliamentary elections. And the people of Ukraine are wonderful. It's a beautiful country and a beautiful, just beautiful cities. Lviv is a great place. I spent about a week there. And so it's hard for us all to watch what's happening. But since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, there have been over 4.6 million refugees who've left Ukraine. Some are coming here. Most are going to places like Poland, Romania, and the Czech Republic. And I know there are people here that are working to help them. But also within Ukraine, there are 6.5 million internally displaced people. And 90% of these, the people that are fleeing, either fleeing their cities to another city like to Lviv in the west if they're staying within the country, or going to Poland or Romania or Bulgaria or Germany, one of the European countries. 90% of them are women and children. So this humanitarian crisis creates an opportunity for human traffickers. They target the vulnerable, and they look at those who live in regions that are rife with political discord, where there's instability, and where there are poor and marginalized communities. And the massive disruption that's taking place in Ukraine, and as we're seeing entire cities destroyed by Russian artillery block by block, that's created a huge pool of targets for traffickers, and especially those traffickers involved in the human sex trade. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has stated that the organization's on high alert, because what they're looking for is, as these refugees, and we've seen refugees pour over the borders, and they're being greeted, and some of the most heartwarming things, I think all of you have seen the photos of the strollers that moms in Poland have brought to the train stations and to the airports, and they've left the strollers there so that Ukrainian women who are coming with their children, because their men have stayed back to fight, and the bravery of these Ukrainian fighters is something that's really wonderful to behold. I mean, they love their country, and they're fighting for their independence, and they're giving Vladimir Putin a bloody nose, and I know we're all in favor of that. But their women and children, in many cases, have left, and they've left their husbands and brothers and sons behind to fight. And so while there's these wonderful things like the strollers, we also have predators that are there claiming to be aid workers, claiming to help, offering transportation, offering housing, and accommodation and assistance. And that's something we've got to be very careful and watch. And the UN is watching it, and other groups are watching it to make sure that predators can't take advantage of that situation to engage in this horrific trade. Now let me go from Ukraine across the world to China. And by the way, Xi Jinping is watching what's happening in Ukraine because he wants to take Taiwan. And how we respond to Ukraine as a country, as the West, as the free world, and how the Ukrainians respond to the Russians is going to inform his thinking on Taiwan. But we also know that beyond Taiwan, in the western province of Xinjiang, the Communist Party of China is engaged in a genocide. Secretary Pompeo officially declared on behalf of the U.S. government, and it hasn't been repealed, President Biden said the same thing during his campaign, that there is a genocide taking place against the Uyghur people. Hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs are being held in extrajudicial concentration camps where they're detained, they're subjected to forced labor, to torture, to sexual exploitation for the women, political indoctrination, and other human rights violations. And so we always say never again. And I lived through Rwanda. I've been to Rwanda and seen what happened there. And we said never again, but Rwanda happened. We said never again, and Xinjiang is happening with the Uyghurs. So it was terrific that we passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It received bipartisan support in Congress, and it's a step in the right direction for helping these oppressed people. And what the act basically says is there's a presumption that anything that's manufactured in Xinjiang, even to a small extent, has been manufactured with forced labor. And as a result, it will be barred from ports of entry into the United States. And the Chinese are very unhappy about this. And there are even some American companies that are unhappy about this. And I'll say, unlike the Malouf companies, which are incredibly stringent on their supply chain, and some of the other companies that are represented here, and that's another thing to be proud of Sam and Kacie and their team about, is to make sure that their supply chains aren't infected by this forced labor. But other companies don't have the same motivations, unfortunately. And so we've got to watch our supply chains. In the free world, It's not just the Uyghurs, it's happening in other places. The free world has to get together and make sure that our supply chains are not infected with products that come from slave labor. There's also, it's not just the manufacturers though, it's the financial sectors. Because the financial institutions and the banks have to follow the money. There's a huge amount of, if we're ever going to get a true handle on this trafficking problem, we've got to follow the money. And the money is massive. I mean, one of the ladies who was up here before talked about numbers, and they're somewhat numbing. Trafficking in totality is $150 billion a year business. And we've got a lot of business people here. That is a massive business. And that $150 billion that's gained from trafficking allows these criminal organizations and terrorist organizations to run the gamut, to finance the gamut of their operations and expand their operations into other forms of illicit activity. And we've got to stop it. Now, trafficking in all of its forms, whether it's narcotics trafficking and the trafficking in fentanyl and opioids, which kills scores of thousands of Americans a year. The last statistics were 100,000 people died of opioid overdoses in America last year. To the sale of looted antiquities. Many people here have traveled to South America and seen the pyramids and seen some of these sites. Those sites are being looted by the same traffickers that are trafficking in the narcotics because they can make money selling the looted antiquities. To forced labor, where people are being forced to work in Dickinsonian type factories here, but also abroad. You know, not just the Uyghurs in China, but all over the world. Forced labor is being used in some cases in the most despicable circumstances in gold and silver and diamond mines in Africa. And then to the terrible abuse of women and children in the sex trade. This trafficking in all of its forms destroys lives, and it destroys societies, and it destroys countries. And what I've always said is that countries that tolerate trafficking are weak and appear weak to their adversaries. And that's why during our administration, during the Trump administration, we made combating trafficking in all of its forms a high priority, because that's what strong nations do. They combat this scourge. So let me run through a couple of things that we did, and I'll end it by saying I'm pleased to see that the Biden administration, to a large extent, is continuing many of these policies. So Ivanka Trump led a team of officials who worked with a bipartisan group of lawmakers, private sector leaders, and the NGO community to advance the government's fight against modern slavery. The Trump administration passed 9 pieces of bipartisan legislation in Congress to combat human trafficking around the globe. And Utah Senators Mike Lee and Mitt Romney and the entire congressional delegation were big factors and big supporters in making sure that bipartisan legislation passed. President Trump doubled the Department of Justice's funding to prosecute human trafficking compared to the prior administration. And he took a personal interest in the issue. In 2018, President Trump made history when he became the first sitting U.S. president to attend the annual meeting of the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. And for those of you, and I know there are a lot of people here with Washington experience, we've got the Congressman here, that sort of personal attention when the principal, when the Congressman or the Senator, or especially when the President or Vice President actually shows up, that sends a strong message that this is a priority, and it was a priority for our White House. At the 2020 Summit on Human Trafficking, the President signed an executive order combating human trafficking and online child exploitation in the United States. And this executive order created for the first time a full-time position of a czar to combat human trafficking. In March 2020, my good friend Bill Barr, the Attorney General, launched the Voluntary Principles to Counter Online Child Sexual Exploitation and Abuse to guide the technology industry in its effort to prevent child online exploitation. And we heard a lot about that in the prior panel. There's a hidden story that's a very sad story in America, but that we're starting to get our handle on. And it's an Indian country. And Ivanka Trump opened the first cold case office in U.S. history in Indian country to help the tribal leaders and the tribal authorities open cold cases primarily of women who were sexually exploited, murdered, or killed. And no one ever found the perpetrators. And then after that, worked with Operation Lady Justice to open 5 additional offices. In September 2020, General Barr announced over $100 million in DOJ grant funding to combat human trafficking, the largest package in U.S. history, which included the first ever funding for safe, stable housing for survivors of human trafficking. And that's something that Sam and Kacie and the foundation here, as many of you know, have been instrumental from the very start of their involvement in this issue, but now with the homes and that sort of thing, They've been attacking that issue of making sure, what do you do after you bust the perpetrator, after you get the bad guy and you put them in jail? What happens to the victim? And making sure that there's a helping hand there to help the victims. One of the things, I had a great team at the National Security Council, and we did a lot of things that you've heard about, whether it was the Abraham Accords and bringing peace to the Middle East, or bringing peace to Serbia and Kosovo, or getting NATO to fund $400 billion in additional spending, or taking out terrorists like Baghdadi, or getting hostages home. You don't hear a lot about this issue, but it's the National Security Council that was behind all of these initiatives and coordinated it. And one of my colleagues, Brian Kavanaugh, who was our Senior Director for Homeland Security, is here with us and works closely with the Malouf companies and the Malouf Foundation. And I want to thank Brian for his efforts in office. I get to take credit for a lot of it as a National Security Advisor. I always try and give credit to the President. But it's folks like Brian and his colleagues that were working behind the scenes and rolling up their sleeves and getting this work done. So thank you. Now, the Biden administration is continuing our efforts, and they just released the 2021 National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking in December 2021. And again, I want to stress this is a bipartisan issue. This is not a Republican-Democrat issue. There are plenty of Republican-Democrat issues out there. And some of you may go to the Republican convention here tomorrow. I'm flying off to Washington State to speak to the Republican Party there. So there are plenty of issues that we can be have our civil fights over. But this is an issue that has bipartisan support, and is not an issue that should be controversial to any extent. And I'm glad you're going to hear from Congressman Blake Moore, who's going to be on the panel, because Blake has the reputation for civility and the reputation for reaching across the aisle to get things done that are important for Utah and important for the United States of America. And this is one of those issues I know he's going to continue to work on. But let me be clear, this is not an issue that the government can solve alone. And it kind of reminds me, Ronald Reagan used to say, the worst words you can hear from a government official is, I'm here from the federal government and I want to help. And so the government can't do it on its own. The government can do a lot, and we did a lot. But this is a whole of society effort. We talk in government about a whole of government effort where we've got all the agencies working together on an issue. And that's something we've tried to do with this issue of human trafficking and trafficking in general. But this issue, as we heard from the ladies that were here before, this is a whole of society issue that we have to address. And we've all got to work together to defeat this scourge. And today's summit is just another example of what the Malouf Foundation is doing and their commitment to helping forge a public-private partnership in this critical fight. So the foundation is striving to expand relationships and build strong coalitions of individuals and churches and civic groups and charitable organizations and NGOs to come together on this mission. And through its partnership with the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, I don't know if Elizabeth is here. I know she was here last year. Is she here? Hey, Elizabeth. What a terrific combination to get Elizabeth and Sam and Kacie together. But together what they're doing is they're amplifying and expanding their initiatives to confront human trafficking, sexual violence, and exploitation. And I was really excited to hear that the three of them linked up together and the two foundations have come together, because it's just more bang for the buck when we take on this the folks that are perpetrating this evil. So Sam and Kacie and the foundation and Elizabeth, they've demonstrated leadership in this important area of ensuring that victims' voices are heard. Because again, like the post, making sure that there's treatment and help and assistance for people post-conviction for the victims' voices need to be heard to inform law enforcement, to inform all of us, the community that's working to fight this effort. We've got to hear from the victims. And there are not a lot of organizations that focus on that. It's a lot more interesting, and you feel better about catching the perpetrators. But making sure that the victims, that their voices are heard throughout the process is critical, and that's something that the foundation is doing. So as individuals, I'll wrap up here just shortly, we need to increase our effort to take on this crisis and this challenge. And one of the ways we can do it, and this is what you're going to hear about from the panel, is to engage with our elected officials. And it's not just the president, it's not just the vice president or the senators, the congressman, but it's at every level of government. It's the mayors, and it's the city councils, it's the first responders, it's the elected sheriff. Engage with your elected officials, and don't be afraid to reach out to them. And again, at all levels, to let them know that you expect action on this issue of trafficking. So this challenge is immense, but we've proven time and again as Americans, whatever's thrown at us, and even beyond this issue of human trafficking, whatever's thrown at us, America wins. I'm incredibly optimistic about the United States of America, whether it's notwithstanding the catastrophe that we saw in Afghanistan, notwithstanding what we're seeing in Ukraine today, notwithstanding this massive competition that we have geopolitically with China, America always rises to the occasion, and we always meet the challenges, and that's what defines us. And I'm confident that with all those challenges, but especially with trafficking that we're talking about here today, we're going to come together as a people. We're going to, and it's going to start here. It's going to start with the Malouf Foundation. It's going to start here in Utah. It's going to spread from here across the country, and then it's going to spread beyond America. And that hope that we've heard about today, that hope is going to spread to places like Ukraine, and it's going to spread to places like China and Xinjiang province. It's going to spread all over the world, and this is the spark that is going to light that flame. And so I'm just privileged and honored to be here to be a part of it. Thank you for having me and inviting me. And let me close by just asking, may God bless you, each of you, especially the survivors and the first responders and the nurses and the doctors and the social workers and the therapists who are working with you. May God bless the people of Ukraine during this crisis, and the people in China who are facing oppression. And may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Hello. It's very bright, and I can't see your faces out there, but if you have energy, because we're going to talk about my most favorite subject, and that is that we can change the world, and we don't have to accept how things are. We can oppose sexual abuse and exploitation wherever we see it, and when we speak up, we see change. And so I want to talk a lot about that, and I want to comment on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So I'm a good ally of theirs. I direct the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Sometimes we get mixed up. National Center, both in DC. They are wonderful partners, and I'm so grateful for the work that we're able to do together in Washington with corporations. And I think after the last panel, what we realized is that we need systemic change. The responsibility shouldn't be on victims to have to stop the spread of the abuse that's been created and filmed of them from being shared over and over again. We need these tech companies to change. I will just say we do a lot of corporate advocacy. One of our campaigns right now is against Google. Why? Because we also file lawsuits. I'll get into that in a minute. But some of our plaintiffs who are survivors of sex trafficking had their abuse filmed and uploaded to websites like Pornhub, like Twitter, like Snapchat, and like Google. And even after we send like 150 takedown notices to these tech companies, they still pop up on new websites. Google told us with one of our plaintiffs, it didn't look like she was coerced. She must not be a victim of trafficking, so we're not going to take the images down from Google Video and Google Images because we don't see signs of coercion. We had proof her trafficker was in jail, right? We need there to be kind of a minimum, we need there to be accountability in the tech industry. And your senator, Senator Lee, I just got a bill last night that we've been working on together that he will introduce soon. We'll do something like that, creating kind of minimum standards so that tech takes down these kinds of abuse material. So congratulations, Utah. You have some really great representatives, including one up here in Congress. But why are they doing it? It's because many of you have joined with us in demanding that the corporations change and that Congress and your state legislatures change things. So I hope you feel inspired after this and that you realize that it's easy to get involved in advocacy and policy. And so let's get started. Representative Romero, I would love to just kind of go down here and ask you all, why did you get involved in public policy? Because lots of us want nothing to do with politics. Why did you get involved? And tell us a little bit about some of the work you've done on sexual abuse and exploitation.
Well, I interned in the Utah House of Representatives, and this is going to age me, in 1994 for the late Senator Pete Suazo when he was in the House of Representatives. And so I was actually mentored at a young age to run for office. I didn't know if that's what I wanted to do, but Pete and others in my community from the Latino community mentored me to run for office. And then I got elected, and I'm like, wow, what do I do now? And I think I was on an airplane, and I was reading People magazine, and I saw something about Aaron's Law, and that was to do child sex abuse preventative education in the schools. And I'm like, wow, this just makes sense. So I'm a freshman in the Utah legislature. I'm in my 10th year now. And I was like, this will be really simple to do. Oh, was I in for a roller coaster ride? And I just want to point out Elizabeth Smart up there and Ed Smart and Deandra Brown. I don't think I would have passed that bill without them. So it takes a community to pass a bill. And so all this bill was going to do was and our current president, Stuart Adams, was my Senate sponsor. All the bill did was that we wanted to mandate that schools teach child sex abuse preventative education. You think I was asking them to, I don't know. It was just really odd, the opposition I got. So to make a long story short, we were able to pass the bill 2 days before the session end. We were able to keep it an opt-out versus an opt-in, and we were able to pass it with schools being able to choose whether they wanted to teach child sex abuse preventative education, so it gives the school district the choice to do that. And it's been successful. I work a lot with Prevent Child Abuse Utah. So that was kind of my first introduction into that realm. And prior to that, nobody really took on child sex abuse because it was kind of a taboo. And then all of a sudden, because I passed that bill, I was just given a whole bunch of bills. And so some of the other bills that I've been able to pass is safe harbor. So now anyone who's under the age of 18 is considered a human trafficking victim, and they're not criminally prosecuted. I also passed the bill to mandate the testing of all sexual assault kits, and we were eventually able to secure that funding. And we no longer have a backlog here in Utah. We're one of 8 states that doesn't have a backlog, which is really amazing. And this last session, I was able to get funding for the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girl Task Force, which is a bill I ran 2 years ago with Senator Hinkins, and we were the co-chairs of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Task Force. And that's just to highlight some of the legislation that I focus on, but I've dedicated my career in the legislature. I've had wins and I've had losses to address sexual assault, human trafficking, and domestic violence. And I'll tell you, I'm a liberal Democrat from Salt Lake City, and I'm able to do this because I know the importance of bipartisanship, and I know the importance of negotiation. And as a policymaker, I don't think about the political aspect of it. I look at the human rights aspect of it, and I work with my colleagues to make sure that I'm doing what I can for some of our most vulnerable populations here in Utah.
Thank you. Yes. The really incredible thing about these issues is that it truly is bipartisan. We're seeing Republicans and Democrats at a time when they don't want to agree on anything else. They're agreeing on issues of human dignity and respect, and that's something we can celebrate and take advantage of as we work for a better world. And Congressman Moore, tell us about how you got involved in public policy.
Right, so I'll be very candid, it wasn't because of trafficking.
That's okay.
There was a progression that sort of led me to this point to be able to be in, and largely has to do with the awesome work that the Malouf Foundation is doing, and that's a key constituent in Logan. I represent the northern part of Utah in CD1. With 4 representatives in Utah, we deal with a lot of different specific things for our general areas, but it's a small enough place that we all work together. But candidly, I got into politics in January of 2020, and I was just frustrated with our debt, to be honest with you. But I'm not going to go down that road right now. But we were at a point where our economy was operating on all 4 cylinders, and we never heard the word coronavirus before, and I decided, I just want to take advantage of this economic opportunity and go and see if we can't do something. It was just something I was really frustrated at. Professionally, I was in a consulting job, here in Salt Lake, and that's what kind of compelled me into doing this. But this is where the transition into getting involved in a lot of these issues, and I want to just quickly highlight where I'm going to get a huge eye roll and probably get scolded later, but I'm going to ask my chief of staff to quickly stand up. Rachel Wagley, she's here today. She may not even stand up. There she goes. We got it done. Thank you. When we talk, when we talk these policies, when we talk Sosta Festra, she wrote them. So she was previously working with Representative Ann Wagner out of Missouri, who's led a lot of the charge on trafficking. And when I met her in an interview situation, she was interested in being my chief of staff as I came onto Congress. It was amazing the type of legislative background that she had. So she has been leading this for several years, and then coming into work in the Utah environment from the Missouri delegation. Linking up with Malouf Foundation has been just a perfect partnership. And so we've been able to push a lot of things. And I won't go down into a lot of the legislative details, but the Earn It Act is something that we're also working on right now, and that's a continuation of previous laws that were put in place in 2018 to just continue to hold tech companies accountable and to reform Section 230 so we can make sure that, a lot of times technology changes so rapidly that it always takes, legislation and regulation to catch up to it. But this is happening, it's getting out of control. And we need tech companies to be able to partner and be able to stop this type of crime going on. And so we're working on a lot of that type of stuff too.
Thank you.
You bet.
I can echo my love and respect for Rachel back there, who's a force in Congress, and so much good has happened. And the Earn It Act, you all, is the most important piece of legislation for child protection right now before Congress. And it has overwhelming bipartisan support. If you look it up, though, online, you'll think it's a bad bill because there's so much disinformation coming out. But really, it just creates common sense and fixes some loopholes so that tech companies fix flawed platforms that child sexual abuse material doesn't flourish. And we're so grateful for your support, Representative Moore, on that. And you all helped us pass Earn It Act. So. Ron, I have loved getting to know you the last 2 days.
Thank you.
Tell us about your work.
I am a prosecutor in Muskingum County, Ohio, and policy involvement for prosecutors essentially begins when you start working in a prosecutor's office and you see how various laws impact victims, and it makes an impact on you as an individual when you sometimes have to sit in front of a family and they ask you about a particular sentence that a perpetrator's received, and you can tell them that this is what it is today, but I don't know what it's going to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now based upon what happens in your state legislature. Because there can be reforms, there can be adjustments, the addition of good time credit for criminals. In Ohio right now, we have a bill that's been put forth and our office has aggressively testified against that would reduce penalties for child rapists. And we cannot understand where the support comes from. What we're told is that changing those penalties along with some other penalties that impact different types of crime will save $43 million. Well, as a policy position, I guess the question that we want to ask is, what is your safety worth? How many children have to be victimized? How many people have to die as a result of drug overdoses? How many people have to be shot before we decide that $43 million to release people from incarceration isn't worth our public safety? So we may not as prosecutors love the idea of becoming involved with public policy decisions, but there are things that are thrust upon us. So obviously one of the things that I've been involved in is child sexual abuse and human trafficking, and that started 24 years ago. I was a prosecutor and asked to be involved with the abuse unit dealing with the crimes against women and children, and I was asked to give a 2-year commitment. After about 6 years, I was the head of the unit and had an opportunity to go back to my small hometown, which has about 86,000 people in the county, 28,000 live in a city, another 58,000 right outside of the city or in little towns or burgs or out into the country. And I went back and my boss said, you're going to be in charge of all of this. And I said, okay, what we need is a child advocacy center. So for 14 years, I chased a child advocacy center. And there would be times where there would be hope, and then it'd fall off. And more hope, and it would fall off. Speaking with various people in the community, you gain some support, but not enough to pull everything together. And then, I think it was December of 2018, I had a chance to have a meeting with some people who had opened a distribution center in our county, Sam and Kacie Malouf. And I walked out of that meeting and called my wife and said, this is going to happen, because I don't know that I've ever met two more sincere and committed people to something that is instrumental. So, thank you, Sam and Kacie. That has really been the story for me since then, is to stay active and making certain that everything that I do in my office benefits my community and victims who hopefully turn into survivors after they go through their process. And I have to tell you that 14 years chasing a dream that you think is never going to happen, in 10 days, our Child Justice Center, Heroes Landing, opens for business. So thank you.
And these centers, the children's advocacy centers, are so critical, and they do so much good. You have them here in Utah, and that's a good way to get involved as well. I want to ask you what the role of survivors has been in your work, your policy work and advocacy work, and how has that helped you? And Ron, can I toss it back to you and we'll go this way?
Sure. Sitting down over the past 20 years, I've seen the development of resources for survivors. 20 years ago, the idea that people would go out and actively seek help for something that was oftentimes considered an issue to be dealt with in the family, because it was embarrassing for the family to have somebody who had been sexually abused. It often involves family members. You're taught as a kid the idea of stranger danger, which is the dirty old man that's down in the park. That's not where child sexual abuse originates. It's almost always with somebody that is familiar with the child, whether it's a coach, a teacher, a family member, a pastor. So you get into those situations where nobody was getting help. And with the development of the Child Justice Centers brought together the idea of a multidisciplinary team approach, where you had individuals who would sit, and a child would only have to tell their story once, but they would tell the story once, and it would be observed by law enforcement, by a prosecutor, by a mental health person, by a doctor. And then the services would be put in place around that individual so that they were given the best opportunity to succeed. So I think that type of development over the last 20 years, where this issue has really been dragged out into the light a little bit more, there's still a lot of shade over this issue, because it's not something that you sit down at a dinner party and talk about. But it needs to be if we're going to have change. And that's happening. We just need to accelerate the rate at which it's going.
Look, you mentioned survivors, and there's so much to address. Like, there's so many things, particularly from where I sit and from where our state legislators sit, and there's several here today. And there's so many policy decisions to be dealing with. And sometimes you shouldn't be doing anything. Sometimes you need to fix something and address it. But I would say, what drives our motivation? What drives us to make this part of our push and our platform, to co-sponsor a bill or to help write that particular piece of legislation? And I apologize for mentioning just a few, but and I was living at the University of Utah when Elizabeth Smart situation happened. I mean, it just affects you. It's a part of it. That's something that this community and then the nation really lived through and experienced, and we have to do something about this. And then you hear the story from Sam and Kacie. So much of this whole motivation is about their kids. Like, they want a better future for their kids. And it hits you close, the Snow College incident this year. That was the niece of my former boss at my previous company. And I got involved with that, and I was calling the Department of Public Safety. And so sometimes it's something personal that makes it a priority for you. And that's kind of what's happened, at least in our office. And we just have to, we have to find a way to navigate the crazy political environment, working closely with organizations, with the corporate world, with nonprofits to come to some reasonable solutions. But where does the motivation come? It comes from the amazing people that have had to go through something and like not letting their experience be in vain.
I would share that sentiment. My first bill, as I mentioned, HB 286, that bill wouldn't have passed without the voice of Elizabeth Smart, Ned Smart, Deandra Brown, and a lot of other survivors, and they're the reason they did not give up. They were there at the, I think Ed and I were attached at the hip, but they were there at the Capitol every day just to make sure that that bill wasn't going to fail. And so for me, most of my focus is it's a team effort. As a policymaker, I'm there to create that policy, but it's up to me to listen to the experts because I'm not an expert. And I think a lot of times, you know, I've worked on these issues for a long time, so I have some expertise, but I don't know everything. So I depend on Dr. Julie Valentine, who's a SANE nurse, who's focused on sexual assault, who's known across the country for her work, and survivors such as Elizabeth Smart and Deandra Brown and others who have helped me kind of look at through their lens on how I draft legislation, because I want to make sure that I'm supporting them and I'm not re-traumatizing people either. So that's kind of how I always look at policy. And it's a little different for me because I'm more local, whereas he's in Congress, so it's a little more difficult sometimes to interact as much, where at a state and local level, the interaction is, you have more access to that. But again, none of this would happen without my colleagues here. I see Representative Johnson. He and I have been tag teaming on domestic violence and sexual assault, and we were able to get TANF funding this year and last year, $3.3 million for preventative education, so that we're not having the conversations we're having now, where we're talking about healthy relationships early on in our schools, and we're providing those services ahead of time for individuals, so that maybe we're not talking about this as much as we have to. But again, it's centering that voice of survivors, because I've noticed, we always talk about rehabilitation. I think that's important. People need to be rehabilitated, and we put so much money into that. But I feel at times we forget about survivors, and we forget about how much money we need to invest there. Because if you look at many people who have a lot of trauma, and you talk to them about where that trauma came from, a lot of times it stems from childhood, or it stems from some kind of sexual assault. So if we could address that and work with people, just because we give short-term services to someone who's been a victim of sexual assault or child sex abuse, doesn't mean that they're going to heal the way they need to heal, because we're not continuously providing those services. So for me, my mission is to make sure that we're not forgetting victims and survivors, and we're investing as much money in them as we are with rehabilitating people.
Thank you. I want to add just another example. In my advocacy, both with legislation and with corporate advocacy, I found that we win almost every single time when survivors are at the table, when they're the ones driving the solutions. And one, I think that you will appreciate, we got MasterCard to stop processing payments for Pornhub, because Pornhub hosts endless amounts of child sexual abuse material and other non-consensual content, and many survivors had come forward. We brought survivors to the table to meet with MasterCard executives, and MasterCard adopted an incredible policy to make sure that there's minimum consent. And now they're helping with some legislation. But the pornographers also went to meet with MasterCard and make it seem like we're on the up and up. This is a legitimate business. We don't use, CSAM or trafficked individuals in pornography. And MasterCard said, I heard from survivors that that's not true, and we're going to listen and follow survivors. And they made their policy because of the voices of others. So I share this with you. Good job, MasterCard. I share this with you to help you realize in your advocacy that you can help lift and empower the survivor leaders in your community and give them a voice. And that's also advocacy on your part. I want to go now to the importance of policy and the impact that maybe good policy has and the consequences that bad policy could have. If you have some examples in this space of why we need to care about policy, because there's good that comes from it or bad. Who wants to go first at this one?
I'll jump in. You're right. There's always externalities to every policy decision you make. It makes it so difficult. It's what makes so much gridlock a lot of times. And I'm going to highlight just a brief example of getting something done, though, because a lot of times, and particularly in Congress, it's not easy to, the shocker, everybody, it's not easy to get stuff done in Congress very easily. I know, take note of that. Yeah, that's the big takeaway for today. We hosted a roundtable out in the Uinta Basin. So Uinta County County Attorney John Sturmer helped us sort of get a group of law enforcement officials out in the Uinta County, so the eastern part of the state, just to highlight the issue. So we had the U.S. Attorney's Office there, we had the Attorney General's Office, and then just a group of this rural area that wanted to learn more about trafficking and how to go about addressing it. And kind of introduced the idea, got them at least interested in moving this along, and then John Sturmer really rallied to put together a training with FLETC, with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, that worked to come out and really provide information and all of the latest on everything that's gone on policy-wise and what opportunities they have, what they have the ability to do at this point, what comes down the road. And just, sometimes it's not about legislation. Sometimes it's not about policy. Sometimes it's just getting something done and getting the awareness out there. And that's what I've seen from the Malouf Foundation as their big focus is awareness and making sure that people are aware. So there's enough policy right now that we can go and tackle and get a lot of this done. Can we get better? Can we get the Earn It Act passed? Absolutely. But there's enough to do right now, even as policy and its slow-moving, the slog that requires. There's a lot we can get done with just some little bit of elbow grease, to be honest with you.
I will say that policy-wise, for us, there's a lot of frustration. And the frustration stems from the fact that taking care of these issues require people to set aside partisanship. And for whatever reason, it doesn't always happen. And one of the struggles that we have is it's great to be able to take survivors to the table, but there have been exceptional examples that you've seen today. Not every survivor is in that position. So it becomes difficult when you want to go have a survivor testify in front of an audience of lawmakers. And one of the examples that I like to use when people ask me about, why is it so difficult? And I tell them, and I'm pretty candid, and I want everybody to think about their last sexual encounter. And then, how many of you would feel comfortable coming and sitting up here and describing it in explicit detail, and then being questioned about it like you were a liar? Because that's what victims go through in trials. So the idea of going in front of a panel and testifying about what they need as survivors isn't amongst the top list of things for them to do. So when they do go and they testify and the legislatures decide not to listen, what message do we send? So it makes it very difficult for us as prosecutors to say, what you're going to do is really going to make a difference when I won't lie to them about it, because oftentimes it does not. So that's our frustration with policy.
I would agree with him on that. So I'm very careful. I always have survivors helping me draft policy, but we're very careful about who we have come testify before, because I've had some very interesting experiences and with policymakers. None in the room. The ones in the room have been great, but when I start to run legislation, so the Safe Harbor bill in particular, where former Representative Jennifer Seelig ran the first bill, and when she ran that, because she wanted to make anyone under age 18 when dealing with commercial sex is considered a human trafficking victim, when she presented it that way, they had to amend it because there was an individual in the house at the time who said, well, what if this young woman's enticing that older gentleman to have sex with her? So there was a lot of victim blaming. And so I've seen us as a legislature come a long way, both in the House and the Senate, in not victim blaming. Do I think it still occurs at times? Yes. But she wasn't able to pass that bill the way she wanted to, and then I was able to come in and do that for her. But again, it's about believing survivors, because sexual assault and human trafficking and even domestic violence is so underreported because people don't feel like they'll be believed. And so I never want to put a survivor in a situation or exploit them to pass a bill. So I'm very, very careful about how I engage with survivors when it comes to policy. And I always remind survivors too, I'm a policymaker, I have an MPA, I'm not a social worker, and so I always make sure that I send them to the resources they need to get the help that they need, whether it's counseling, because not everyone who survived human trafficking or sexual assault wants to go to law enforcement. So I want to make sure that I'm centering that survivor as a policymaker and making sure I'm providing them with the resources and services they need to move forward in their life. And a lot of times that might not be through legislation, that might not be through law enforcement, it might be through self-healing.
I want to clap for you because that's so critical, and to be responsible. And I wish that all of your colleagues in both the state and federal level could hear that we can't re-exploit and use and further the exploitation. I want to talk now. I still feel so nervous picking up the phone and calling Congress or my local legislators. I still feel nervous, and I've done it a ton of times.
There's a lot that don't feel so nervous. They call a lot.
But
I almost wish some felt a little more nervous.
we want you to call. We want you to feel comfortable calling and sending emails. And I want to just talk about, so some are annoying, right? Some are super
I didn't say
annoying. I'll say it for you. But some really super help. Talk about how like the general public, citizens, concerned citizens have helped shape the exploitation and abuse work that you've been engaged in, and help us feel like we could pick up the phone.
Go ahead.
I think starting off an email or a phone call by not telling me I'm stupid. The political climate now is really interesting. I've received, I think this session was the toughest session for me when it comes to hate email or people feeling like they could just yell at me and call me by my first name and not, when I first got elected, I told staff, just call me Angela, and the staffer sat me down. She's like, you're representative to me, and you'll always be representative because you worked you worked really hard. I was going to say something else, I caught myself. You worked really hard to earn that title, and so you need to use that title wherever you are, and she taught me a good lesson. But for me, it's just having a conversation with us. We're human, we're people, and knowing that we might not have all the answers that you're searching, but we will do everything we can, or our staff will do everything we can to help you, direct you to those services. And so it's about how you go into that conversation. When I'm advising people how to send emails to my colleagues that they may not agree with me on a policy issue, I always tell them to tell them why you are opposed to that policy or why you support that policy in an engagement, in a way where you're engaging and you're not fighting with someone. Because I can tell you, when I get an email and someone's like, I think you're dumb because of this, and I think you suck because of this, I'm not really wanting to engage with them. Will I do that if they're my constituent? Yes, because they live in my district, but I just don't. I think right now, I don't know how you feel, but the climate can be interesting, and God bless our staff, because they take a lot of calls that we don't take, and we just really value them. But really, it's picking up the phone, because you never know. You can change policy. Like I had a constituent this year. She works for the Humane Society, and she's like, hey, we really want to include pets in protective orders and stalking injunctions, because a lot of people won't leave a domestic violence situation because they don't want to leave their pet. And I'm like, okay, let's try it. And the bill passed. But again, it was my constituent making a phone call and giving me that call, and me working with all these advocacy groups, and we were able to pass that bill that I didn't even think we were going to pass. But the thing is, it's taking that risk and doing the phone call. And I'm not saying everyone's going to be nice on the other end, but just because someone's not nice to you doesn't mean you can't call somebody else and they'll listen to you. Because I get calls from people that don't live in my district that have given me ideas, and then I work with them. So I think call someone, whether they're your rep or someone you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, my old boss at my consulting firm, he said it a little tongue-in-cheek. He says, Blake's really, really smart. But the smartest thing about Blake is his willingness to collect input. So by saying that, he kind of means that I need some help. I want help. I want to be able to know what's going on. And actually, I spent 7 years, many folks in this room may know Dan Jones, the late Dan Jones. I spent 7 years sort of working alongside Dan, and then when he passed, did some of his polling work as well. And so it's a two-way street. We as representatives need to make sure we're capturing information and doing it so it's a representative sample to understand the sentiment, and then understand where folks feel about particular issues. But then there has been numerous occasions where, and just one recently, where a delegate, because we're going through the convention process right now, and a delegate reached out and was imploring us to be involved or supportive of the Earn It Act, and she was thrilled to find out that we were already co-sponsors of it. And that's happened several different times. Reaching out to your elected representatives, highlighting things that you might be concerned about or passionate about, and then we'll take that information and we'll run it through our vetting process to know, are we supportive of this bill? Or we can't. I mean, there's so much there's so many 6,000 pieces of legislation at the Fed. You're never going to be on all of them. You shouldn't be just co-sponsoring all these things unless it's something that's specific to your district and something that you care about. But there's a clear way to be able to collect that input from folks and implement it, and make sure you just create the communication. Something that we've really tried as a team is to outwardly communicate, and we've loved it. And and for the vast majority of the time, I agree, the political climate is tough. It's toxic in a lot of ways, but it's incumbent on us to cut through the chase, to provide the real information, and I'm really proud of our team, particularly because we have a newsletter that we put out once a week. And I have 3 times as many followers to our newsletter as I do my Twitter account. Twitter's not like Twitter, social media. It's not a good environment to have debate and to have information shared. For us to have 3 times as many people to our factual reality, the things that we're putting out, and people are engaging that way has been a really, really cool thing that our office has experienced. But I just think it's encouraged folks to reach out and offer ideas and things that they want us to be focused on.
As far as engaging with constituents in my area, a lot of it has been working to educate the constituents, the people that call my office, because usually people that are calling my office are calling to be upset about a sentence that somebody received not being harsh enough, when that's the maximum that they could get. We don't get to hang people up in front of the courthouse and throw rocks at them, which is what a lot of people would like to do. And to be honest, I'd like to give them that option sometimes, but we can't. One of the things that we've done is with press releases, we don't just provide information about what happened with a case. We try to provide a little bit of education about why it happened, explain a little about what the laws are, what the sentencing ranges are, and why our recommendation may or may not have been something that they agreed with. I think that we initially, we started this a few months ago, and initially there was a lot of negative feedback, but we've learned in the past few months that as we add more information about the process itself and what we're able to do, that people are becoming more informed. And I think it's incumbent upon elected officials to make sure that your constituents, that the people that live in your jurisdiction, understand what your role is and what your job is. Because if they don't understand, a lot of the complaining and negative comments come from a place of lack of information or misinformation. And I think it's been essential for us to get the correct information to people. And we've seen more positive feedback.
Thank you. I want to keep talking to all of you, and there's still a lot to talk about. We have to close up now, but I want to leave you, I really hope that you recognize that your voice really matters, and that you should not just accept the culture as it is. And as you speak up to advocate with corporations and businesses and in your local community, at the state level, at the federal level, they listen and we see changes. Bad policy is doing things like taking funding from survivors. It's doing things like tying the hands of law enforcement. It's doing things like decriminalizing sex buyers. And we're seeing the prostitution marketplace and sex trafficking just explode because of it. But good policy is creating safe spaces online for our kids. Good policy is allowing survivors to be debt-free. An incredible bill just passed Congress doing that. It's allowing for accountability for the right people and not for survivors. They should not be criminalized. So I just want to leave you feeling, I hope that you feel inspired and that you recognize your voices, it really matters, and that those petitions you sign and those calls you make, they make a difference. So thank you for being here. And with that, we're done.
Thank you.
Well, today has been amazing. I first want to thank all of you for being here. I know you're all really busy people, so it means a lot that you would come today and spend the day with us talking about this issue that's important to us. I also want to thank all of our speakers and our survivors. I know it takes a lot of strength and resilience to come on this stage and talk about these types of things in front of a big audience, and I'm just so grateful that they're willing to do it so that we can learn from them. So I want to give one more round of applause to our speakers. There's a couple of reasons why we feel so strongly as a foundation about having this summit, and one of them is education. It's one of the main things that we focus on in our foundation, and we really feel like when we get people in the room talking about and learning about this issue, that's how we can start to create change. And then the second reason we really want to host this summit is to challenge all of you to join us and to help us figure out how we can change the direction of this situation. And so I wanted to share a couple of examples that came after we held our summit last year, just some things that people did after they came here. One of them was really exciting. We had someone in the audience who was listening to the survivors talk about how education had changed their trajectory of their lives and in their healing process. And he was thinking about how he knew some people from Southern Utah University, and they had a program called the Speedway Program, which is a 4-year online bachelor's degree in general studies, and it's really, really affordable. And he connected us with Southern Utah University and said, hey, why don't you guys create a scholarship together? And we were able to do that. We created the Juniper Scholarship last year. This person also went and talked to some people that he knew that he thought might be interested in donating money for the scholarships. And so because of this person's action, today we have 43 fully funded scholarships that we can give to survivors of sexual exploitation. And for us, that was such a huge win. It was never something that we would have thought of on our own without this person coming to us and saying, I have this great idea. We've had other partners do other really, really great and innovative things. We've had one partner that creates ice cream sandwiches, and they named one after our On Watch program and talked about it on the back and directed people to go there and take the training. We have one of the trucking companies that we work with in our for-profit business that wrapped his truck in On Watch branding, and that truck goes thousands of miles every month, and thousands of people see it every day. And so we're grateful for that, just raising awareness about this issue. We had a company, another lighting company that we work with that we love, and they created a light fixture, and not only did they give that light fixture away as like a symbol of hope to survivors, but whenever they sell that light fixture, they donate a portion of the proceeds to the Malouf Foundation. So really, when we think about it, the possibilities are endless of ways that we could work together to create change. Today, we've invited a lot of other amazing nonprofits here that do work in a similar space, and we would love for you to connect with them. Hopefully you already have, and talk about ways that you guys can work with them. We also have representatives from the Malouf Foundation here today. I think Jake, Aniko, and Sage are here, but if you guys could just stand up and wave your hands. I see Aniko, but anyways, if you can want to connect with them after, or you can talk to Sam or I and just talk about ways that we can work together. We have had some really amazing speakers on a national level, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the National Center of Sexual Exploitation here today too, and we would love for you to connect with them, figure out ways we can all work together to further this cause. If you don't feel like you have the time or the resources right now to invest in something like that, we would love for you to just take our On Watch training. It's a 1-hour free training. Clay talked about it earlier, but it helps you learn to recognize and then report the signs of human trafficking around you, and it's a great first step to starting to generate some movement and some excitement around this issue. So we're just so grateful that you come out and spend the day with us. We hope you have a great weekend. We appreciate all of your support, and we will see you next year. Thank you.